What is everybody, Kyle Murray from FTN Daily back again with the Murray model video, bringing you a first look at my model for this week's NFL DFS slate. We have week 4 on our hands, already 3 weeks in the books. Last week was okay, had some really good plays, but a lot of injuries that also derailed some really good lineups. So that was a little bit of a bummer, but that is part of the NFL DFS scene. But we're looking to have a better week here in week 4. Hopefully one that, ends up with healthier lineups and all that good stuff. But without further ado, let's get right into it. Let's take a look at this week's model video here. Let me pull it up right here. All right, so here we have the stacking model where you guys can see my stack ratings for the week. Buffalo up at the top. I believe they were up at the top last week as well. Obviously, this matchup against Baltimore, one that has been a pretty friendly matchup to opposing teams so far this season. You can see on the right there, no team has allowed more fantasy points to opposing teams so far this season than the Baltimore Ravens. But just in terms of the high-flying offense that the Buffalo Bills are and what they're known as, they're going to be a fairly popular team, as you can see. Highest owned team on the slate, but they still have the highest edge percentage. That's just because of how likely they are to actually hit their target score and how likely they actually are to be the top stack of the week. Now, with all that being said, I do think that it boils down to a spot where it is somewhat of a larger slate. Again, 12-game slate, not the largest that we've seen this year, but you have a handful of options, 2 handfuls of options really, in terms of teams that you can really make cases for. So I think it is going to be fairly spread out. So although they are number 1, I don't think that they're necessarily going to need to be avoided strictly based on their ownership there. So that is one thing to note. You can see over here, average ownership about 15%. Based on the quarterback and the top 2 skill position players in their offense. Now, the thing where this ownership gets a little bit tricky is I decided to make it the top 2 skill position players rather than the top 2 pass catchers, just because there's going to be plenty of times where the running backs are involved in a stack or whatever, so that might throw some things off in terms of the stack ownership there, but that's kind of where we're at right now in terms of the average ownership. It is currently quarterback plus the top 2 skill position players. So running backs can be involved in the stack ownership. But as you can see, they're number 1. You have a pretty clear drop-off between the next 2 here. And I think this game is super interesting. I'm very curious as to where this game, the Seattle and Detroit game, actually comes in terms of ownership. Now, there are 2 ways I think you can play this game. I think you can just full-on game stack it and embrace the ugliness that the quarterbacks kind of are, like Geno Smith and Jared Goff. Geno Smith's been pretty good this year. Jared Goff's even been pretty good this year in his own right. But those 2 don't possess the natural upside that guys like Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Justin Herbert, even with the injury, Jalen Hurts, like these guys are just very clearly in a tier of their own. Now, you can embrace this and say, okay, if Geno Smith goes out and scores 25 points, if Jared Goff goes out and scores 25 points, as long as the quarterback doesn't go for like 40 plus, you got a really good chance at that quarterback paying off for you big time. Now, keep in mind, every single week this year, we've had a quarterback go for 40 plus. Lamar's done it 2 weeks in a row now. Josh Allen's done it, I believe, twice as well. Patrick Mahomes in week 1 was right on the cusp of that. He's not going to be on the slate this week since he's on the Sunday night slate, but you guys get the point. If you have a quarterback that goes out and puts up 40 plus, like a Josh Allen, like a Lamar Jackson, you just don't have the potential for a Jared Goff or Geno Smith to match that. And I know even though you are getting the salary relief, it's a huge opportunity cost. Like they just don't really have the opportunity to score 40 plus. I mentioned the 25. That's probably like sort of near their cap, right? Like they need to put up 25 to even really have a chance to feel good about this. So you can take that path and say, okay, a quarterback maybe won't go off this week, won't go completely nuts, and these 2 can pay off from a value perspective, or they can, have a really good game, come up near that 30-point mark, and be, the optimal quarterback of the week. The second path is to stack this game, but without a quarterback. And, basically the way to do that is either do a mini stack with 1 running back, 1 wide receiver, 2 wide receivers, whatever you wanted to do there, or you can even be a little bit more aggressive with it and say that you wanted to use 2 position players from one team, bring it back with another one without the quarterbacks in the game. The way I probably plan to approach that as of now is to do a mini stack. The running backs are going to be decent options in my opinion. You got quite a few good wide receivers as well. So there's going to be definitely a bunch of ways to do that within this game. So that's my current lean in this game. It should be a really interesting game environment. Detroit continues to play very fast. They're third in adjusted pace on this slate. Seattle not so fast. They're 13th in adjusted pace, but again, being on the top half goes somewhat of a long way in terms of where they are at in the NFL. So I do think that this game could be fairly quick. And again, I think that there's just a few really good options. You look at the Detroit team total. I don't know if, me personally, as someone who lives in Michigan, has been a Lions fan over the course of his, life, I guess. I never would have thought that they would have a higher implied team total than a team like Buffalo or a team like the Baltimore Ravens or pretty much any of these teams. But here we are, 28 implied team total. That is a monster number, leads the slate. So it's definitely something to consider. And I don't want to rule out Jared Goff because, again, there are going to be slates where we don't have guys at the quarterback position go for 40+. And that could be a good spot where Goff kind of slides in there. So definitely something to know. I will definitely have exposure to both of these teams and in this game, but it kind of just depends on how I want to approach that. Now let's talk about this next team, Carolina. I'm not going to lie. I definitely need to do some digging in to why this team was surfacing up near the top. They've been absolutely brutal offensively so far this season, arguably one of the worst teams offensively that we've really seen. It's been really bad. Not a lot of good takeaways. Christian McCaffrey hasn't really necessarily been used in a way that I would hope he would or want him to be if I was going to be confident rostering him in DFS lineups. He's not overly involved in the passing game. We've seen no production from DJ Moore, essentially. Robbie Anderson had a really good week 1, but after that, he's also kind of disappeared as well. So Carolina kind of rose to the top. Arizona's defense has been quite bad this year. When we look at the Vegas implied total here, it's nothing to be excited about. The 44 implied game total. So honestly, I think this might be a spot where I'm sort of trending towards going against the model. But when you look at the matchup, Arizona has been really bad defensively, especially in the secondary. They're allowing the most yards per play, the second most yards per pass attempt. So there is some intrigue based on the matchup, but I just can't get behind using any of the players, especially the wide receivers. I think that this could be a good week for a DJ Moore bounce back. I haven't even looked at his price yet, so we'll check that out when we get to the wide receiver position. But in terms of a stack, there's no way I'm using Baker Mayfield. Now, one thing I do want to note is the stack model obviously is kind of the place I go to look for some of these top stacks, but it's also at times a good indicator just on who's in a good matchup. Like Carolina rises to the top because they're in a good matchup based on all the metrics that I'm using and pulling in together here, but that doesn't necessarily mean you need to stack them or use this tool just as a tool to identify stacks. You can identify some one-off plays, some top plays based on this tool as well. So keep that in mind going forward, and obviously this tool is updated at FTN Daily every single week, so check that out as well. But next up, Pittsburgh, again, a team I won't be stacking. Like if I'm going to use a quarterback that I don't really have a ton of confidence in terms of really having an elite ceiling, it's not going to be Trubisky, it's not going to be Baker Mayfield, it's going to be Jared Goff, or maybe Geno Smith. There's just no way I'm going to find myself using guys like Trubisky and Baker Mayfield. Now, Pittsburgh, again, just like Carolina, does have some interesting one-off pieces. You have Najee, who everyone's pretty much just down on. I don't want to say out on, but down on for sure. Deontay Johnson, who's continued to be peppered by targets. So, and they're obviously in a good matchup here against the Jets, who struggled defensively this season as well. So again, probably a spot where I'm more so looking for a one-off play rather than stacking Pittsburgh. So keep that in mind. Again, another way to use the tool. Don't necessarily need to use it in the manner of just finding, okay, how can I build a stack? You can use this tool to identify some good matchups as well. Now, Baltimore on the other end of this Baltimore and Buffalo game. We already talked about Buffalo. They're the favorites in this game. They have a 27.5, 28 implied team total. Second highest on the board here. Baltimore's at 24.5. This is the highest game total on the slate. And it's, by 2 points, which is a fairly good margin here. But the one thing I think is super interesting about Baltimore is, again, going to be the ownership. And we kind of saw it at times last week with the Buffalo and Miami game, where it was a game that people were very clearly targeting, but they were really only using it one way. It was going to be the Josh Allen way for the most part with Diggs. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily going to be such a clear line in this game because you have another elite quarterback, and I don't know if people necessarily wanted to consider Tua as an elite quarterback just yet when building lineups last week. But with Baltimore, Lamar is definitely in that realm. So I don't think the line will be as clear. But again, we'll take a look at quarterback ownership when we get to the positional breakdowns. But as of now, I think attacking this high total game, but on the flip side of where the public tends to be leaning, could be very interesting. And based on the stack ownership, it appears Buffalo is going to be the more popular stacking option. So Baltimore, I think, could potentially end up being one of my favorite games or my favorite stacks of the week. Chargers need a bounce back week more than maybe anybody in the entire NFL. You see them here ranking 7th in the stacking model. No surprise, they're a high, a prolific offense, high-powered offense that has simply just struggled, right? They have a 25 implied team total, so it's a number that's up there. Don't mind going to the Chargers here. Obviously, Herbert gets another week of rest, another week to get healthy. I think it's going to go a long way in terms of kind of providing a little bit of extra horsepower for this Chargers team as well. Potentially get Keenan Allen back also. And I don't think that they're rolling Keenan Allen out unless he's going to play. That's another thing there that could be very interesting, as the ownership could potentially be pushed down on that stack and Keenan Allen in general. So the Chargers are definitely a team that I have a ton of interest in. But again, it doesn't need to just be in a stack. Austin Eckler, I do have a ton of interest in. Austin Eckler, I think, might be one of my favorite plays of the week. Again, I want to check out the ownership. I haven't done a ton of in-depth look at the ownership. Basically, a little bit of the process is the baseline numbers will come up Wednesday. Lots of adjustments and manual edits will happen Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. But right now I'm recording this Wednesday night, so I've done a lot of updating with new stats and stuff like that, so I haven't necessarily dove into the projections a ton. So again, this is going to be more of a first look thing, but that's kind of how I actually like these videos to turn out. So we'll check out Eckler when we get to that position there. Philadelphia coming at number 8. This feels like a low number here. Now, when you look at a couple of things that I really like to look at, and I am going to mention them here in these two numbers here with the Philadelphia game as well as the Chargers game. When you're looking here, look at the pace. Both of these teams and both of these games are playing very fast. Philly's number 2 on the slate in terms of pace. The Chargers are inside the top 8. Houston's 4th. That could be a very fast game. Philly's, like I mentioned, is 2nd. Jacksonville is 6th. This game could be a very fast game. Now, the one thing I do have concern about with Philly, just like I did last week, I think Philly has the best defense in the NFL. They are damn good. It's just simple as that. They are so good, top to bottom, really, defensively. So now, not to say that I want to hold that against the offense, because that wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense. But in terms of wanting a team to find themselves in a shootout, it might be a little bit more difficult for Philly to find themselves in a shootout if nobody can score against them. Jacksonville's offense has looked very good this year, so I think that they can potentially keep up a little bit. They do have a 21 implied team total, so I wouldn't necessarily count that out, but it is something that I just wanted to mention because I think that it is a point worth mentioning there. But Philly, Jacksonville, like that game. Chargers, Houston, like that game as well. Another game that I really like. However, I think that it's a little strange because, you look at the Atlanta and the Cleveland side. You're talking two teams that are playing very slow, running the ball a ton, but this game is producing a super high game total. Now that tells me that Vegas is expecting these teams to have a good amount of success running the ball. Let's take a look at some of these DVOA metrics here. Both teams, bottom 5, bottom 6 in DVOA against the run. You look at both teams, they're also, bottom half in yards per play allowed. Atlanta is bottom 7 in yards per play. So again, I think that both of these teams could benefit that way. But again, I just don't find myself being interested in stacking this team, or this game, I should say. Now, here's where I think that a nice little mini stack could be very, very appealing. Someone like Cordell Patterson with Amari Cooper, vice versa, maybe Drake London with Nick Chubb, or maybe another one of my favorite plays of the week, Kareem Hunt. So we'll talk about that when we get to the positional segment as well. But don't know if this is going to be a game that I'm stacking a ton with quarterbacks. I think it's definitely going to be a good mini stack game to attack, though. So Let's see, any other teams that we want to mention? New York has a really good value percentage, which basically the value percentage is how often this team hits their value threshold based on once again, their quarterback and their top two pass catchers' salary. It is I guess a metric that changes every week, but typically in between 3 and 3.5x their overall salary. And they have the second best value percentage number there. Again, teams who are cheaper are going to find it, they have a higher number here just because of, it's easier to hit the value threshold when you're cheaper. But New York, again, this number is being boosted quite a bit by Saquon Barkley. When you're talking having a quarterback like Daniel Jones that's cheap, a couple wide receivers that are cheap, who also project pretty well with Sterling Shepard being out. Kenny Galladay might never play football again after what we saw Monday night. That was a whole nother thing, but completely terrible. Kadarius Toney, Wanda Robinson potentially out again this week, so you have some value options at the wide receiver position as well. Don't know if I full stack this team or this game, but they do stick out as a team that might have some decent value. And then again, when you look at some of the pace stuff, New York's playing fast. They're fifth on the slate in terms of pace. Chicago, they're running the ball a lot, but they're also playing quite quick. 10th in terms of adjusted pace there in neutral scripts. So that is the stack breakdown. Let's head over to quarterbacks here. We're going to sort it by salary. I think a thing that I mentioned up top of the stacking segment was you have a fairly clear breakdown in terms of ceiling, right? It's going to be Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts. And that's pretty much it. Like, these guys are definitely in a tier of their own. I do think that Kyler and Justin Herbert could potentially compete there on a good week. But, Herbert, I think for sure, I think the one thing that is in my mind that might hold him back a little bit is the injury. Kyler, I think on a good week can definitely compete with that, but we've seen a lot of struggles from Kyler so far this season. So right now, as it currently stands this week, I think Josh Allen, Lamar, Jalen Hurts, a little bit of a tier of their own. Now, I do think that when you're looking down the board a little bit, a couple of really good options. I just don't know if it's as strong of a week, to pay down as it was last week. But for me personally, you see Lamar Jackson, he doesn't have necessarily as good of a projection as some of these other top guys. But again, the ceiling is definitely still there. He's in the same game as Josh Allen. Could be a really significant shootout in that atmosphere. So I really like Lamar Jackson. He might be my favorite quarterback just based on the fact that I think he's going to be a little bit lower owned there. But Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, more than fine in that tier. Herbert is the guy that I like quite a bit here, especially if we get some positive reports on that health. I mentioned the mid-tier, Jared Goff, Marcus Mariota. I mentioned not using the quarterbacks in that Atlanta-Cleveland game, but I would be remiss to not mention Marcus Mariota here. He projects really well, best point per dollar option on the board. Also talked about Geno and Daniel Jones as punt options. Again, probably don't get to them a whole lot, but Jared Goff would probably be the guy I find myself using the most here. Might get a little crazy with Geno Smith or Marcus Mariota, but in terms of if I'm not using one of Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, or Jalen Hurts, Goff's probably the guy I'm going to and looking at. So that's something to definitely consider. Another thing that I think is interesting about Jared Goff is I think we'll also see Jamal Williams be very, very popular, so it could be a nice little leverage play as well. Speaking of Jamal Williams, let's head over there. Let's check out these running backs now. Let's go ahead and sort it by projection, actually. But as you can tell, Jamal Williams currently projects as the most popular running back on the slate. Josh Jacobs as the second or third. That's an interesting spot there. He's very cheap, and he's getting a lot of really solid usage there. But Josh Jacobs versus Dameon Pierce, I might prefer Pierce in that particular case at the ownership there. But let's talk about these guys up top. You talk about McCaffrey, you talk about Jonathan Taylor, two guys who, I don't want to necessarily downplay the struggles or the concerns here, but it's hard to really take that 3 weeks that we saw from them and write these guys off or maybe say they're not worth the price. Like, in terms of what we saw from Jonathan Taylor week 1, he is more than capable of that any single week, especially in a spot against Tennessee, who has looked pretty bad across the board so far this season. Then you have Christian McCaffrey, who for me, it's just waiting on him to get more involved in the passing game. I just don't think that they continue to hold him out of the passing game. Now, whether it's a scheme thing or a Baker Mayfield's decision thing, hard to know, but either way, I don't think it can, last. I think eventually they're going to have to get him involved in the passing game because he's just so good in the open field and in the passing game. And you talk about Saquon Barkley here. He's been nothing but good, really. Obviously, week 2, we had a little bit of a down week there. But when you're talking about the usage, the upside, pretty much everything that you want out of a running back one, Saquon provides. Nobody has a better opportunity share on their team outside of Saquon Barkley, other than Christian McCaffrey, who has a 42.3 opportunity share. After that is Saquon, then is JT, then is Derrick Henry. So I think that is another thing that is worth noting there. Saquon Barkley's having that sort of role that is similar to someone like Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor, these elite running backs. That's kind of what we expected from Saquon Barkley, but it's good to see that it's actually coming to fruition. So I have no problem with anybody who wants to side with Saquon over McCaffrey and Taylor. The Bears defense has, I don't want to say been good, but they've been in bad environments at times. But, we saw Dameon Pierce get it done against them last week. I think Saquon Barkley's a lot better than Dameon Pierce, even though, Twitter really likes Dameon Pierce. I really like Dameon Pierce as well, but I think Saquon Barkley might be, a top 3, top 5 pure running back in the NFL. So Saquon Barkley, I think, can definitely get the job done. And based on what we saw from him in week 1, I also think that we could potentially see some more passing game involvement from Barkley as well. He had 7 targets in week 1, followed up with, I believe, less than 4, either 3 or 4 in both of the weeks 2 and week 3. So maybe more passing involvement for Saquon as well. Eckler is the guy here that I really, really like this week. When you're talking about his usage, he doesn't necessarily pop in the opportunity share as much as these other guys do, but he is definitely there in the target share. 18% target share on the year. That's a big number for a running back. It's second highest on the slate. The only running back that has a higher target share on this slate is actually Javonte Williams. We'll get to him in just a second. But Eckler, I really can't feel super optimistic about him getting overly involved in the running game, but it's definitely not going to continue to where it is now. Last week we saw them get absolutely routed by the Jacksonville Jaguars. That's not going to happen every week. He had no chance to get involved in the running game. I think he had less than 5 carries. He also had 9 catches or 8 catches or whatever it was. I think the passing game involvement probably stays pretty consistent as to what we've seen. I think the rushing involvement probably improves just based on, I guess logic, or based on just, positive regression. In terms of last week, it was definitely an outlier. They had no opportunity to run the ball. The game was a complete blowout pretty much from the start. So that'll improve, that'll change, and I'm pretty optimistic about Eckler's role here, especially in a spot where they are once again the favorites in a matchup against Houston. So Eckler might be my favorite play up here at the top. I think there's also a great case for Nick Chubb. For Nick Chubb, it's a little different because you need him to score touchdowns and or run for a ton of yards. He's not going to be involved in the passing game the way a lot of these other guys are, and that's a problem in full PPR standpoint. Now, you're talking FanDuel or Yahoo. Makes a lot of sense for a guy like Nick Chubb here, but in terms of on DraftKings, when he's priced up near Saquon Barkley, near Austin Eckler, I don't want to say necessarily near Jonathan Taylor and Christian McCaffrey, but he's not far off. And when that's the case, I'm going to side with those guys, but he is in a pretty good game environment. Let's talk some cheaper guys here. Jamal Williams, 6,100. Sounds like DeAndre Swift is going to miss this week for sure, potentially a couple of weeks as they're letting him deal with that shoulder injury. Sounds like they want to rest him, try to let him get a little bit healthier. Jamal Williams projects really well. He was already getting monstrous amounts of red zone work and goal line work, so he's definitely going to retain that now. I think, even with Swift fully healthy, he's probably going to have a good crack at that. But obviously with Swift out, he's definitely going to retain that role. And that's a high value role on a team with the highest implied team total. That's all you can really say about Jamal Williams. And I think that we potentially see some more involvement in the passing game now that Swift is out. I mentioned Javonte Williams. The turnaround is coming for him. And I know it's been frustrating seeing Mike Boone get snaps and Melvin Gordon get the goal line carries, but Javonte Williams is, I think, a good, if you're, let's go to the usage report here. This is something that I like to, like I said, call the usage report. Now, in terms of the overall snaps on the season, Javonte Williams is getting 56%. Melvin Gordon's getting 37. Mike Boone, he doesn't even crack this little table here because he hasn't seen 10% of the snaps on his team. So keep that in mind as well. Sure, we saw him get involved on Monday night or Sunday night or whenever that game was in prime time. I think it was Sunday night. And yeah, that's going to frustrate people. But he's not necessarily a factor. Now, when Melvin Gordon's on the field, he's getting the ball. That's just going to happen, and he's going to get touches. So a lot of people who just look at touches are going to see, oh, Javonte Williams got 15 carries last week. Melvin Gordon got 12, and Javonte Williams only has 3 more carries than Melvin Gordon. But the snaps are very clear. But the best part about Javonte Williams are these target numbers. He's seen 21 targets this season in just 3 games. He has a 21% target share. Last week, he had a 5-target game. That was his worst performance in terms of volume in the passing game. That equated to a 15.5% target share. I think a lot of signs are pointing up for Javonte Williams. And the big thing is this offense has just been absolutely brutal. I get it. It's just been terrible. When you look at their team total here, 21.5 against a terrible Las Vegas defense. But I just don't buy that this team is that bad. I think that they're going to improve. Lots of teams in the NFL start slow and then they turn it around. Lots of teams start hot and they end up sucking. We've seen it time and time again. We saw it with Sam Darnold last year. The guy was being talked about as an MVP candidate, and then all of a sudden he fell off the face of the earth, and he lost his starting job, and etc. You know how that story plays out. It happens vice versa too. Teams start off very, very poorly. For example, a bad start that comes to the top of my mind last year was Jonathan Taylor, when he had less than 200 yards through 3 games, ended up finishing with 1,800 yards or whatever it was, and scored 30 touchdowns. I don't think it was actually 30, but I think it was north of 20. He had 0 touchdowns through three games, and he had less than 175 yards. Like, these bad starts happen. Denver is obviously having a very bad start, and don't get me wrong, it's very, very bad. But San Francisco, not a bad defense. Houston, I don't want to say is a good defense, but I don't think that they're completely putrid like they've been in the past couple of years. And in the Seattle game, Russell Wilson had a good game. So touchdowns are definitely going to change. Like, this Denver team is not going to continue to not score. I don't think Nathaniel Hackett is doing a good job at coaching, but I don't think that means he's just doomed for. But when you keep in mind the amount of touchdowns that this team have produced, I want to say it's like 3 offensive touchdowns in 3 games. I think Russell Wilson has 2 passing touchdowns, and then Melvin Gordon has 1 rushing touchdown. Now, I might be wrong on that. That's off the top of the head, but that's not going to continue. Like, you can look at any team in the NFL, and you can say that that's a rate that's not going to continue. Teams are going to score touchdowns. It's just that simple. So Denver is going to improve. They kind of have to, because they've been maybe the worst offense in the NFL, especially the past 2 weeks, but they're going to improve, and when they do, I think Javonte Williams is going to be a major beneficiary of that. So absolutely love Javonte Williams this week, 6,600. I think it is a great buy low spot. I think he's going to be involved regardless, whether they're in a good game script or bad game script, or whether that be passing game script or rushing game script. I think he's going to be involved either way. So I like Javonte Williams. I think this is a great time to buy low on Javonte Williams. All right, Cordell Patterson, similar deal to, kind of how I mentioned Nick Chubb, where they're kind of in a good game environment where there's a lot of points expected to be scored. Cordell Patterson's been heavily involved. No issue with him at all. And I think that, again, same thing happened to Cordell last year where he was playing really well. People didn't buy it. They didn't play him. He scored 2 touchdowns, and everyone's like, oh, why didn't I play Cordell Patterson? So I think it's totally fine if you play Cordell. But it is a tough matchup, and there are some good plays in this range. For example, you have Najee Harris, who I didn't even mention yet. Javonte Williams right there as well. A big thing about Cordell Patterson last year was how involved he was in the passing game. You're looking at Najee Harris, Javonte Williams in the same price range, both guys who have been more involved in the passing game. So I think Cordell's just in a kind of a soft spot here, but Najee I think is super interesting. Like, again, he's 6,700 against the Jets. He could easily score 2 touchdowns, catch 5 passes, and he's scoring 25 plus points, and he's a guy that you really want in your lineups. Again, that offense hasn't looked good. Najee hasn't necessarily looked good either, but I think this could be another good turnaround spot for Najee. So this range is kind of a buy low range for me this week, and I really like it just based on the fact that a lot of the ownerships are down, a lot of the prices are down, and I think the prices are down and nobody's looking to attach themselves to it. So the running back position, I think, is a really good one this week. James Conner, I also think, is kind of in the same boat. I think he has 1 touchdown on the year. This guy scored like 15 last year or whatever it was. He played 65% of the snaps last week despite dealing with an injury. That week to get healthy is going to help him here. I think he probably gets back to 80% of snaps again like he was in week 1. So I think that's very interesting for James Conner, who was also pretty involved in the passing game. He had 3 catches last week. So again, 3 catches and wasn't playing his typical allotment of snaps. So I think that could go a long way. Dameon Pierce looks to have the early down work absolutely locked up. He's going to average 14, 15 carries a game. And I've seen a lot of talk about Dameon Pierce as of late about, him if in the spot where if they're not winning the game or if they're out of the game. I get it. Like if they're in the fourth quarter and they're down 10 plus points, he's probably not going to be on the field. But I think that based on what we've seen from him in the last 2 weeks, the first 3 quarters, they're going to try to get him the ball. They're going to try to feed him. And if he can take advantage, then that's all you really need. So I wouldn't necessarily be afraid of Dameon Pierce just because he has a lack of pass game work while he's still this cheap. Now, if he gets up to 7K, then yeah, I probably don't want to deal with that. But he's essentially like Josh Jacobs right now. He's probably not going to have a ton of work in the passing game. He's going to be a little bit of touchdown dependent. But again, he's going to get fed. I think that's very clear. I think he's going to get a lot of work. So Dameon Pierce, I'd like a little bit this week as well. Kareem Hunt, I also have a ton of interest in. I think he's like a sub 5% play. Here you can see 3%. I think he's a sub 3% play, sub 5% play that could potentially break the slate. I think that's really interesting here. He leads the NFL in red zone touches. Now he gets to face Atlanta in a game where you have the second highest implied game total. Ton of points projected to be scored by Vegas in this game. Breece Hall, I also like. He finally stepped over Michael Carter in terms of snaps last week. I think he continues to trend in that direction. Khalil Herbert, as you can see, still have a lower projection here. Haven't got a ton of confidence in what we've seen from David Montgomery on the injury front. Eberflus comes out and says, he's day-to-day, but then he also says can't rule out an IR stint. So obviously looking for more clarity there. If he's out of practice tomorrow again, Dave Montgomery, that is, like he was today, probably just make Khalil Herbert the full-time starter. If that's the case, he's going to project for 16-plus carries, probably a couple targets. He's probably going to end up being the better play than Jamal Williams, in my opinion. But, again, I don't know if that's going to necessarily fall in line with the public ownership there, and I think that a lot of people are probably just going to play Jamal Williams and Khalil Herbert together. But that's going to leave a lot of guys here in this mid-range, like Javonte Williams, Najee Harris, Cordell Patterson, James Conner. Going to leave all these guys unowned. So I think that's going to be shake out to be a pretty interesting position there. Now, let's check out the wide receivers here. Stephon Diggs. Amon-Ra St. Brown has the second highest projection on the board. Monstrous. Even higher than Devontae Adams, higher than A.J. Brown. It's a big-time number here. He also got banged up last week, but he came back into the game. Seems to be fine. Seems to be basically a non-issue. He didn't practice today, but it sounds like he's more likely to play than DeAndre Swift is. If Amon-Ra St. Brown plays and DeAndre Swift is out, we can potentially count on a pretty significant uptick in touches and looks for Amon-Ra St. Brown. You also factor in the fact that Josh Reynolds missed practice today. He's been heavily involved in the offense. He's sort of kind of working his way into that wide receiver 3 role. He's kind of duking it out there for the being next in line for targets in that offense behind Amon-Ra St. Brown and DJ Chark and obviously DeAndre Swift and Hawkinson. But he's been pretty involved. So if he's out as well, another potential spot for Amon-Ra St. Brown to be considered as an uptick. Kind of going to fly through wide receivers here. Like Deontay quite a bit. I do like Tyler Lockett. Cortland Sutton, I think, is very interesting. Brandon Cooks, I think, is a really strong play, but he's going to be very popular. I don't know if I love Cooks here with a ton of ownership on him, but he is very cheap, so I'm definitely fine with it, but probably not a guy that I'm overly thrilled about just because of that popularity. Drake London has been fantastic, and he's dominated the targets. He has a 32% target share on the season. That's third highest on the slate amongst wide receivers that are playing in the main slate on Sunday. So I think that's super interesting as well. I mentioned DJ Moore as a one-off. He's 5,300. That's a very cheap price tag. He's down here with the likes of, Jerry Jeudy, Curtis Samuel, Hunter Renfrow might not play, Robert Woods. DJ Moore is a better player and a more explosive player than all of these guys. And although we haven't necessarily seen the role be great for him, he's still playing every single snap. He's like 98% of the snaps, getting 24% of the targets. It's coming for DJ Moore, and I guess this week is a really good chance to see if it will be this week. It's a good matchup. Arizona struggled so far in secondary this year, and he's 5,300, and he's probably not going to be necessarily chalk. I don't think he'll be unowned, but I don't think he'll be chalk either, so I think that is somewhat appealing there for DJ Moore. Romeo Doubs, very happy about the Romeo Doubs call. Last week, I came in the betting show on FTN Bets, said, hey, make sure we're checking out these Romeo Doubs lines on Sunday morning and Saturday night. I popped into Discord. I brought it up like 3 times. I wanted to make sure that you guys all knew that Romeo Doubs was one of my favorite plays in the slate. And I actually said while I was building my lineups, and it was just more so because of the fact that he was just constantly finding his way in lineups because he was a cheap wide receiver with upside. And he wasn't even the best cheap wide receiver on the slate. Mac Hollins ended up being the best cheap wide receiver on the slate, but Romeo Doubs sure was good himself. He had 8 catches for like 80 yards and a touchdown. And like I mentioned Sunday morning, said he was one of my favorite plays of the slate. So glad that panned out. Don't mind going back to him here, but definitely want to see how some injury stuff shakes out. It sounds like Watkins isn't going to play. We'll have to monitor Christian Watson as well and all those guys. Like Richie James here in this spot, he could be this week's Romeo Doubs, but he's going to be very chalky this week, it seems. The pivot off of Richie James is going to be David Sills, who's down here at 3K. Let's see if we can find him. Right here, 3K. Doesn't project great, but he's going to be the pivot. Kenny Golladay. If you had any confidence in Kenny Golladay, I don't know where that went. On Monday night, they tried his best to give him a crack at it. He played 30% of snaps. He looked absolutely abysmal. I feel like just the the biggest fish for drafting as much of him in best ball as I did. Definitely botched that one there. But David Sills appears to be the wide receiver 2 now that Sterling Shepard's done for the year, and with Kadarius Toney and Wanda Robinson potentially out once again. So David Sills someone worth monitoring as well. Zay Jones has been heavily involved in the passing offense. He's an interesting play also, but let's head on over to the tight end position. Mark Andrews is, if you can play him, play him. I mean, this guy's just been a stud. He's got a 37% target share. I think that leads the entire NFL. Might be second. It's either first or second. He's up there. Cooper Kupp's up there. Stephon Diggs is up there. So yeah, I think that Mark Andrews, he's just getting looked at so much. He's obviously in a game that should be a good environment, so definitely like Mark Andrews a ton. I don't mind going back to Kyle Pitts here, but after that, probably going to be a good amount of looking for correlations. Freiermuth, I don't mind as a one-off. Hockenson will pair well with Goff. Everett will pair well with Herbert. Njoku, I don't mind as a one-off as long as that ownership stays under control there. But yeah, tight end's definitely going to be a Mark Andrews or correlate type week. But yeah, that's going to do it for the tight ends, and that's pretty much going to do it for the video. I do appreciate you guys all for tuning in. If you guys are watching this over on YouTube, please like and subscribe. It helps us out a ton. Stay tuned for some of the betting videos and some of the prize picks videos that's going to come out on the YouTube site as well prior to week 4 kicking off. Again, we'll be back next week with the Murray model for week 5. That'll come out, most Thursday mornings, Thursday afternoons. On Fridays, I'll be publishing my 10 under 10 article, and I might also be, doing some video content for those as well. So if you're looking to check out that video, stay tuned for that. That might be up on the YouTube channel as well. But that's going to do it for today. We'll see you guys next week. As always, good luck, everybody.